Good evening, Sukihoto. Welcome to this question and answer forum. I will be doing this forum on a weekly basis. So today will be the first Q&A forum. We label this as QA forum number 1, so that when I post them and we can refer to which forum, then we can refer to some of the questions in there. Right? So without further ado, let's get on with today's QA forum. Now, what I would like to do is that when I receive questions which require quite a proper or deep or thorough answer, I will prepare for it so that at the next forum I will answer them. So feel free to post your questions under the comments of this Facebook page, and I will then prepare the necessary answer for the next forum to answer them. Because every forum I have already prepared them, so the answers for these questions will be quite thorough. So today we're going to cover 4 questions, right? So let's begin with the first question, which was submitted last week, where one of the yogis has basically pointed that he wanted to find out about whether the Buddha sleeps at night. And he said, I was told that Buddha only sleep 1 hour a day. Right? But in modern world, we are advised to have 6 to 8 hours. How do you reconcile the difference? Did Buddha have something special because he was enlightened? The short answer is basically to the last question, yes, because he was an enlightened being. So the brain structure and the brain functioning of an enlightened person is somewhat, there's some slight differences. And these differences allow the Buddha to be able to rest without sleeping. In fact, in my discussions with my teacher, Venerable Dr. Punnaji, he mentioned that actually the Buddha never really slept like we do. He just rested the body. And during the resting, he went into deep meditation. So he basically rested the body. It was not like the kind of sleep that we go through. So I'm going to explain this in 2 ways, an existential way and an experiential way. The existential explanation will be based on science and scientific explanation of human brain and what happens when a person goes to sleep. And then we will touch on the experiential perspective after that. First, we take a look at the answer from an existential point of view. That means looking at the body and the functioning of the brain. Now, when we look at the way the brain works, the brain allows us to have different states of consciousness. So at the most fundamental state of consciousness where we are aware, so we call this conscious awareness. Now, if our mind has become more sharp, able to see more clearly and discern one thing from another, that means it's very critical, then we would have reached a slightly higher state of consciousness known as critical alertness. At this state of mind, our mind is thinking in a very sharp and critical way. Now, all this can be measured in the brain. You see, what happens is every time we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch, there are many different parts of the brain that is functioning, right, and operating. And these different parts of the brain where there are neural networks being fired up everywhere, they need to synchronize. Because if they're not synchronized, then the brain will be, in a mess. And we can't think. That means the brain is totally confused and we cannot even make things out, what it is that we see, what it is that we hear, and so on. In order to be able to recognize what we see, In order to be able to associate seeing with hearing and touching and feeling and tasting and smelling, then all these different parts of the brain have to work together, what we call work in synchronization, in synchrony. And in order for all the different parts of the brains to be synchronized, to work together while we are awake and conscious, then the brain waves have to be synchronized together. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into the explanation of brain waves. Right? This brain wave is basically called the synchronous oscillatory frequency. That means there is a frequency that different parts of the brain will operate at the same wavelength, and then when they are operating at the same wavelength, they are able to synchronize everything together. Now, we don't need to know too deep about that because it's a very deep discussion, right? But what we do need to know is different parts of the brains have to be synchronized, right? And basically, this synchronization operates at the same frequency. Now, if different parts of the brain are operating at different synchronous frequency, then the brain is completely like a jungle. You cannot figure things out. So when it is operating with a brain wave that is measured, right, and it is measured in this range, right, so that is the range at which we are alert, right? And when we become alert, then we can be able to be critical about what we have seen, heard, smelled, taste, and touch. So that blue box basically represents this consciousness and alertness, this critical alertness. At the higher frequency of 30, around 30 hertz per second, that is critical alertness. When it falls down to 15 to 13, then it is at a low level of consciousness. If it falls below that, right, then it becomes drowsy. So this range in the blue box or the blue range, we call this the beta, right? The beta range. Below that is this drowsiness. We call this the unconscious awareness or the subconscious state called alpha, where the brain wave slows down. As the brain wave slows down, the mind becomes more and more drowsy. Okay. Now, just give me a second. I just need to check something online. Just a moment. Sorry about this. Right. I have a small issue that I have to quickly fix. Right. Sorry about that. Just give me a second. I have to fix something before I can continue. This is one of the problem using StreamYard, right? So just give me a second. I'll just quickly do that. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. All right. So when the brainwave slows down, we go into this subconscious or semi-conscious state, this drowsiness state. And we call this the unconscious awareness in the yellow box. As the brainwaves slow down, and this range is called the alpha range or the alpha state of mind. Right? When the brainwaves go down to below 10, then it's alpha. It can even go further down when we sleep. So when we sleep, it falls below that. And there are two ranges when we sleep. If it is 5 to 8, we call this the REM sleep. REM stands for rapid eye movement. REM sleep is not a very deep sleep. That is a state of sleep where we have dreams, sometimes even nightmares. So the mind is constantly working with a lot of thoughts flowing back and forth, so you start to have dreams. So this range between 4 to 8 is really called the REM sleep state, where the sleep is not peaceful. But if it goes down to 4 and slightly below that, you go into deep sleep. And this is really a deep sleep state called slow wave sleep, SWS, slow wave sleep. And that So the REM sleep is the theta state, and the slow wave sleep, the deep sleep, is the delta state. When a person goes into delta state, that means you sleep at that deep sleep state, it is dreamless. In fact, it is very blissful sleep. If every night you can achieve a couple of hours in this deep sleep, it is wonderful sleep. You will wake up feeling very refreshed. But a lot of people, especially people who have difficulties in life, they rarely go into that state of sleep. They go into this REM sleep, the theta sleep, theta state, not the delta state, and that is a lot of dreams, and they still wake up feeling tired and feeling exhausted even, you know. So this is really when brain waves slowing down. Now, when you are awake, you are in the blue box. That is the beta state. As the brain waves go up, that's when you meditate. Your brain waves will go up when you meditate. For people who meditate diligently and have a proper technique, they can bring their brain wave to 30 and above. And going above, then you are going into a gamma state. Now, gamma state is not easy to achieve. This is only achieved by people who are very experienced meditator, who is able to still the mind and able to sharpen the mind. And as you go up into the gamma state, as you go higher, that is when people who practice vipassana, then the brain wave will be in that higher state. So that is a state where the mind is able to see through a lot of things, the state of vipassana. So in other words, when you meditate, your brain wave will go up. If you're meditating properly according to Buddhist meditation, usually we're talking about vipassana meditation to bring it to that state. But even if you do samatha meditation, you would still be hovering at the high end of the blue box. That means you're hovering between beta and gamma. But as the mind sharpens and goes into samadhi, it actually goes high into the gamma range. That is when the mind has gone into a state of samadhi. Right? Samadhi is not at the other end where you get drowsy. That a lot of people think that, oh, when you meditate, your mind will slow down and then it stops. No, that is actually not samadhi. Right? That is drowsiness. Right? That is tina mida. You get drowsy and things like that. So when you meditate and you go into drowsiness, you're experiencing tina mida. Your brain wave is actually slowing down into the yellow box. That's really what's happening. Right? Similarly, if you are having a lot of restlessness, right, udacha kukucha, then you are also experiencing a lot of interference to the brain. Right? Your brain wave may be actually slow because it's not your mind is not critically thinking. So this critically thinking is a very important point. There is a line there you can see. It's called the critical factor. Below the critical factor, consciousness is not sharp, not critical. Above the critical factor, your consciousness is very critical. So people who practice chanting meditation, mantra-based meditation, where you are reciting a verse over and over, trying to meditate by reciting verses, you're actually doing something that is repetitive. It is slowing down the brain wave because you are not sharpening your mind. You're just relaxing the mind, right? So if you use chanting meditation, it goes there. But if you start to meditate by practicing samatha meditation, followed by vipassana meditation, and satipatthana, it actually brings your brain waves to a higher state. And at a higher state, you are experiencing, as you practice satipatthana, that is where your brain wave goes up, crossing into the gamma range. And higher than that, your brain wave will reach a point where it is your mind is at a state of upekkha, when you have gone through the jhanas. At the end of the fourth jhana, you will experience this state of upekkha. So that's really what happens in the brain waves, and how the mind is actually functioning in terms of alertness with respect to drowsiness and sleeping, or being awake, right, and alert. So let's now watch this video, a short video where you will find the neuroscientist Richard Davidson. You can see there he's explaining to the Dalai Lama on his left, and on his right is Matthew Ricard. Next to Matthew Ricard is John Kabat-Zinn, and next to John Kabat-Zinn is Ajahn Amaro. But in this discussion, it's just a short video where Richard Davidson is explaining to the Dalai Lama.
In our work with long-term Buddhist meditation practitioners, we found that meditation is associated with marked increases in electrophysiological signs of activation, specifically in the gamma frequencies. These are high frequencies in the brain electrical recordings. And particularly in the prefrontal cortex, which we see as important for certain aspects of regulating emotion.
What he has mentioned is that he said meditation is associated with marked increases in electrophysiological signs of activation in the gamma range, in the prefrontal cortex, and synchrony between the prefrontal cortex and other brain regions in long-term practitioners. Okay, let me explain this step by step. The prefrontal cortex is that part of the brain in the front here, behind the frontal, at the bottom of the frontal lobe. It's called the prefrontal cortex, right behind the eyebrow. This is the part of the brain where we do critical thinking. And here it's mentioning about gamma range in that part of the brain. So meditation is associated with marked increases. That means the rising, increasing of the measurement, the brain wave measurement. EEG is actually the measurement of brain wave. So meditation is associated with marked increases in brain wave, going activation in the gamma range, in the prefrontal cortex, the critical thinking part of the brain. And the synchrony between this part of the brain and other brain regions, so that you're able to think very critically and examine the experience that you're going through, right, and be able to be critical about that experience. As it goes into gamma range, then the mind is actually developing vipassana, able to see clearly what the thoughts that are arising and how they are arising. And he pointed out this is only found in the long-term practitioners. So EEG, the brainwave, gamma range activation in the prefrontal cortex, the critical thinking part of the brain. The normal thinking brain actually involves the whole brain, but mostly in the frontal lobe, but involving other parts of the brain. But that one just behind the eyebrow is the prefrontal cortex, where we exercise critical thinking. That is where it becomes very active. Right? And this synchrony between the prefrontal cortex and other brain region in long-term practitioners. So in other words, if you practice your meditation well, you will be able to cultivate brainwave activation into the gamma range, and your prefrontal cortex will be operating at that range, and your mind can become very sharp. So very high-level meditators will be able to experience vipassana because of that. Okay, so this is really what the scientists have discovered, and this Richard Davidson is the foremost scientist researching into Buddhist meditation. Now let's take a look at another perspective, the experiential perspective. What happens to a Buddha? Right? So we're no longer talking about the brain itself, because the Buddha would have cultivated his mind to a point where the brain doesn't function like normal people. Now, I'm not in a position to explain what goes on inside a Buddha's brain, for two very simple reasons. I don't believe there has been any experiment that is able to measure the brain function of an enlightened person, right? An arahant. That has not been done. Even though they have measured Matthew Ricard and very high highly accomplished meditators. Whether or not they are at the state of being an arahant, we don't know. We can't comment, right? We can't judge one or the other. But basically, there has not been proper experiment to be able to explain what happens inside the brain of an arahant. So what happens to the mind then, the thinking mind, right? So basically, a person who has become awakened would have cultivated a very special kind of mind, right? And the mind will constantly be dwelling in these 4 divine dwellings. So an arahant's mind would be operating in this, the divine dwelling, the Brahma Vihara, where the mind is constantly in a state of metta, karuna, mudita, or upekkha. This was explained to me by Bhante Punnaji, saying that the arahant, under normal circumstances, the arahant's mind is constantly going through any of these states, right? And in other words, it's not in our normal, regular type of mind. The mind of an arahant is constantly going through these 4 states of universal benevolence or loving kindness, compassion, altruistic happiness, mudita, and equanimity or mental equilibrium, upekkha. Now, let's take a look at the development of samadhi, right? For normal people like us, our mind is operating in this sensual realm where we have to learn, when we meditate, we have to learn how to abandon the 5 hindrances. All this is happening inside the kama bhava or the kama loka. This is the sensual realm where our mind is still attached to existence. And when we are able to momentarily or temporarily let go, abandon 5 hindrances, we can begin to cultivate these 5 jhanangas, 5 constituents of jhanas, cultivating vitaka, vichara, piti, sukha, and ekagata. So once we're able to cultivate this, see, the cultivation of these 5 states are happening in the kama bhava, the sensual realm. But once we're able to momentarily or temporarily abandon the 5 hindrances and cultivate these 5 jhanangas, then the mind enters into jhanas, right? And that is in the rupa bhava, the next realm, the imagery realm. And there the mind goes through 4 states of jhana: 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th jhana. So in this process where the mind goes through the 4 states of jhana until it reaches upekkha, the mind is actually reducing this affective process. In other words, the emotions are completely stopped. And then it reaches, after the 4th jhana, it can then go into very deep states of meditation. They are no longer jhanas, right? They are the 4 states of ayatanas, right? I won't explain much further. This is usually what arahants can do. They can bring their mind into that state. So normally the arahant's mind is constantly in jhana state, and then he brings it into this imageless realm, the arupa bhava. The arahant's mind, as I have understood from the way Bhante Punnaji has explained to me, an arahant's mind is no longer in the sensual realm. In other words, the arahant's mind is no longer attached to existence. Because when your mind is in the sensual realm, the kama bhava, your mind is attached to existence. But an arahant is a person who has freed the mind from attachment to existence. Therefore, the arahant will no longer be, the mind will no longer be in this sensual realm. He will be in this imagery realm, rupa bhava, or it can even go higher into the imageless realm, right? And in fact, very special arahants, not every arahant, but people like Sammasambuddha and a few very highly accomplished arahants like Moggallana's and Sariputta, they can actually go to the point where they can stop the mind temporarily. Right? And the stopping of the mind is this Sanya Vedayita Nirodha. So basically, that is what happens in the mind, the experiential explanation about the Arahant's mind. So when the Arahant sleeps at night, he doesn't fall into sleep like the way we do, right? It's his mind is constantly at the high range, and he's basically resting the body. And then the mind is floating either in these 4 states of jhana or going higher into the ayatanas, and finally even reaching the state where the mind is stopped. Now, it has been explained to me. Now, I'm not, of course, I'm only speaking from what I heard. It has been explained to me that in the case of Buddha, when he, especially during the later part of his life, towards the end of his life, near the parinibbana, he was constantly suffering. His body was breaking down. So the body would be constantly experiencing all kinds of pains. Don't forget that he spent 45 years walking from town to town when he is together with the monks. And of course, he has his supernatural power to be able to travel without walking physically. But when he is with monks and disciples, he would be walking from town to town. So the body would be weakened. So when he feels a lot of pain, he takes his mind into the imageless realm, and also even up to this Sanya Veda Ita Nirodha state, where the mind has stopped. But it can only stop for 7 days at the most, and then he comes out of it. So when we say the Buddha goes into deep meditation, then the Buddha's mind is into these states. It's not jhanas anymore. It's beyond the 4 jhanas. So I hope that basically clears the question. I'm not going to go much deeper than that. And I am not explaining this. I must clarify. I'm not explaining this from experience. I am explaining this from what I have heard and understood. So therefore, please forgive me that I'm not able to tell you all these things from experience. I'm only explaining what I have heard and understood from my teacher, Bhante Punnaji, and also from reading other texts. So this is really the explanation that the Arahant's mind, especially the Sammasambuddha, would be brought into this imageless realm to rest. Because in that state, the mind is very restful. The mind is no longer actively thinking about things. It's resting, right? So that's it. I hope that has answered that question. And did Buddha have something special because he was enlightened? The quick answer, yes. And I hope my explanation helps. I am sorry I can't go any deeper than that. I'm not able to explain much deeper than that. So I hope this answers the question now, right? So that an enlightened being, especially Buddha himself, they don't physically sleep like the way we do. And basically the body is rested and the mind goes into very high state of meditative state. Normally it's jhanas when they are awake, and then it goes into meditative states of ayatanas. Some people call those other, I'll go back to that previous screen. Some people call this imageless realm, those 4 states, they call them the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th jhana. They are not jhanas, they are ayatanas, okay? So basically the answer, I hope, is adequate. Now, these kind of questions are very interesting to know out of curiosity, but for us, it is our practice. So just practice for normal people like us, just practice our meditation so that we are able to abandon the 5 hindrances, cultivate the 5 jhanangas, and able to experience the jhanas. That's as far as we can do for normal people like us. So let's spend our time being concerned about that practice. Don't get too carried away with these supernatural questions. It's nice to know out of curiosity, but at the end of the day, practice is the important thing. Practice the fundamentals, okay? So I hope that answers the question. Okay, that's the first question. Now let's move on to the second question, where this person has mentioned that I am sitting quietly, telling myself, breathe in, breathe out. So presumably the person is trying to meditate, right? I'm sitting quietly telling myself, breathe in, breathe out. I can do this for a few seconds. Then, out of nowhere, a stream of distracting thoughts would enter. What is the spark that triggers such thoughts? And how does the spark come about? So this is basically the question. What is the spark that triggers such thoughts, and how does the spark come about? Okay, it is important to understand this. I'll just go through the whole thing. It's actually default, what is called default mode network. So let's come to that. First, understand how the mind works. According to the Buddha, he used 3 words to explain the mind, and I'm explaining here from what Bhante Punnaji has taught me. So this is based also from my own meditation and my own experience. I'm able to elaborate what Bhante Punnaji has explained to me. The 3 words that the Buddha used to describe the mind, 3 parts of mental experiences. The first word the Buddha used is vijnana, which is actually the process of perception. That is awareness of what was perceived through the sense organs. Basically, vijnana is this big picture. They call it consciousness, but actually it's perception, being aware of what you see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. So this awareness is vijnana. So the mind, so the 3 parts of the mind, the first mental experience is this awareness of what was perceived. And the second is the mano, which Bhante Punnaji calls the cognitive process, where it leads to cognition and conception. So it is basically the categorized identification of perceived image. That means when we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch something, our mind carries a mental image of what has been perceived. If it is something we see with our eyes, then we have a visual image in the mind. If it is something that comes through our ears, we heard something, then there is an auditory image in the mind, a sound image in the mind. So the word image does not necessarily mean a visual image, but here it means sound image. Similarly, if it is something you smell, then it is this the smell, the image of a smell in your mind. Or you taste, then the image of a taste. Or you touch, then in the image of something that you have come into contact with, physical touching. Right? So the mano is responsible for identifying that. And not only that, it is also creating concepts, cognizing the experience into concepts. And because of that, we begin to create choices, what to do next, how to handle this thing that we have just seen, heard, smelled, taste, or touch. So that is the mano part of the mind, the cognitive process, where it leads to cognition and conception. And with concepts, we have choices. Then the third part of the mind is chitta, the affective process, mood and temperament. So this leads to our emotional arousal. That means when we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch something, there is a feeling associated with it, the vedana. There is a feeling with everything we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch, whether it is pleasant or unpleasant. And reacting to that feeling is called tanha. Tanha is really the reaction to the feeling. And Bhante Punnaji has explained it very well, that this is the emotional reaction to feelings. And arising from this cognition, right? And as a result of that, we begin to have mood and temperament. These are emotional states. Mood is basically how you feel about something. Do you like it? Do you don't like it? So it's whether you like something, you don't like something, you feel good about it. That is mood. And whatever you feel about it, there is an urge to want to do something, an urge to react or respond, and that urge is the temperament. That's why they call it temper. It's an urge to react. And at the same time, you personalize everything you experience. So basically, having said that, in a nutshell, there are 3 parts of mental experience. The first part, vijnana, is the ability to perceive through our senses. The second part, mano, the ability to categorize and identify what was perceived and create concepts and choices. And the third part is chitta, which is reacting to the pleasantness and the unpleasantness of what has been experienced, the emotional reaction, and also this clinging, this personalizing, right? Upadana, the clinging or the attachment, the grasping. And that leads us to become self-centered. And in fact, this is the part of the mind which actually causes a lot of problems for us, this self-centeredness. So we're going to take a look at this part of it. So as we know, right, we have talked about brain waves. What is happening is falling below critical factor, the mind slows down and goes into drowsiness. And this is also a hypnotic state. So when people do hypnosis, it falls into that. People who practice transcendental meditation, it falls into that, because transcendental meditation is to focus your mind on an imaginary object, right? And then they call that object mantra. They just use the word mantra to give this object a label. And that label reminds you about an object, and then your mind gets drowsy. And when the mind gets drowsy, the mind begins to relax, right? So transcendental meditation is very helpful for helping people to get out of stressful experiences or even depression. So transcendental meditation has its benefits in helping people who are depressed. But that is not real meditation as we know it as Buddhists. That is not Buddhist meditation. Buddhist meditation actually increases the brain waves. It brings it to the higher state, the Buddhist meditation. So you can see below the critical factor, it is basically interactive engagement with sensory objects. That means the mind is now interacting with the object, examining the object, making stories about the object, and creating concepts and so on. Then the brain waves are slowing down as it does that. But if we were to meditate, we're no longer interacting with objects, right? We actually have sustained focused attention, introspective awareness, withdrawn from sensory objects. We're no longer interacting with sensory objects. We're no longer interacting with memory or imagination or expectations. Basically, the mind is very still, withdrawn from these disturbances, because these are disturbances. Right? So moving on, basically, default mode network. This is a term given by the founder, Marcus Reichley. Marcus Reichley was the professor, he is a brain scientist, professor of neurology, and from Washington University. He did an experiment. He wanted to know what happens to the brain, right? The firing of neural networks in the brain when a person is resting, right? Not really meditating, but resting. So he got subjects to lie down, just relax. Well, they could be slowing down their breathing, just relax, and then they measure the brain waves. And then they start to look at which part of the brain is active. And then they found there is a part of the brain that actually, instead of the brain slowing down to a state where the person, this is idling mind, instead of the brain wave slowing down to a state where the person falls asleep, if that person is relaxed, but the mind is running, idling, then it has a tendency to go into self-centeredness, focusing on the self. And they call this the default mode network.
What is it? What do you understand so far about that default mode network?
It's quite an elaborate system, and if you take a look at its individual parts, you have to come away with the sense that the functions we can now associate with that have a self-referential component to them.
Meaning what?
Well, for example,
that something is going to affect me?
There is a self-referential connection between the memory and me as a person. That we were an actor in the event. what did I have for breakfast? Where was I yesterday? When did I meet this person? And so forth. So memory is a component of it, but it is a special part of memory, it seems, that has this self-referential component. Something else that is very important, if you then leap to the front of the default mode network, one of the distinguishing features are the areas there that are very often associated in general with emotion, but more specifically about the evaluation of incoming information to the brain. Is this good? Is this bad? Is this dangerous? And whatever.
And it would be based on previous experience?
Almost for sure. And actually, it has also been associated with the mental state of other people. In other words, this theory of mind.
The default mode network is involved in the theory of mind?
It's some suggestion that it might be. In other words, your beliefs, desires, and intentions are very important to me, or should be.
So Marcus Reichley actually did not go further than that. He basically stated that when a person's mind is idling, and in that restful state, that idling state, the mind tends to run away. And that running away of the mind into a self-centered mode, he calls this the default mode network. But another scientist did a lot of research into this and is able to explain it better, right? Basically, the way Marcus Reichley has explained it is that he says that the mind is constantly trying to remember the past or imagine the future when it is idling. That means an idling mind is constantly trying to think about the past or trying to imagine about a future. And we know that because when we sit there having nothing else to do, the mind starts to think about past or imagine about future. We do that all the time. And then it goes into the self-reference, self-centeredness. And there are two types of self-centeredness, right? Here it's talking about the narrative focus, where we begin to associate between memory and me. That means thinking what I have done, what have I accomplished, what I have achieved, and basically thinking in terms of episodes in the past, right? That's why it's called episodic memory. And then it goes into a state of emotional evaluation of whatever is going on around us. So it goes into subjective evaluation of the self with respect to the world. And thoughts arising, and they call that, has something to do with theory of mind. Now, Marcus Reichley did not go any further, so this explanation of theory of mind is not well researched, so I'm not going to go much into that. But the key thing is that when the mind is idling, our tendency is to be self-centered. The mind looks at the self, and basically in relation to the past and the future. Another scientist actually did quite a bit of work on it, where he explored deeper into default mode network, right? And that is Ronald Siegel from UCLA.
And what's happening when we're talking to ourselves about ourselves and thinking about what we like and what we don't like and thinking about others is there's the activation of an area of the brain called the default mode network. And this is what's activated when we're not actively pursuing desires or actively trying to achieve some goal. And while this default mode network is activated, we're thinking a great deal about who we are, how we compare to others, what's going to happen to us, and we're remembering things that we've done and planning for the future. And it turns out that it is the activation of this default mode network that is an important part of developing a sense of me or I. So next slide, who am I? It turns out that there are two types of self-reference that cognitive psychologists have identified. One of them is called the narrative focus, and this is when we talk to ourselves about ourselves and particularly talk about our enduring traits. You know, I'm a nice guy, I'm a smart guy, I'm a dumb guy, I'm a mean guy, I'm a father, I'm a husband. All of these kinds of discussions of ourselves in narrative mode. And this involves the words that are occurring in our mind all day long. The other mode, experiential focus, is actually simply noticing the moment-to-moment kaleidoscope of inner experience. the itch, the ache, a thought arising and passing, and the like. And we know that when people are involved in this experiential focus, which those of you who are meditators will recognize is indeed what we're trying to cultivate during mindfulness practice.
Okay, so you heard what he said there. Let's look at what he has mentioned in this default mode network activation. When we are not focused on pursuing a specific goal or concentrating on performing a task, there are two types of self-references. In other words, he basically says when the mind is idling, that means we are not engaged with doing something, like we're not driving a car, we're just sitting there and the mind is not trying engage with any kind of pursuing any goal or concentrating on performing any task. So the mind is idling. Then the mind falls into two types of self-references. That means self-centeredness. There are two ways, two types. But usually it's almost 99.9% the first type. So the first type is called the narrative focus of self-reference, self-centeredness, right? We question, now this is the trouble, we are judgmental. We are always judgmental. We start to ask questions about who are we and how we compare to other people. We become very judgmental, comparing, right? Competing, comparing, right? And basically that is really narrative focus. We keep having concepts about how us in relation to other people, what's going to happen to us. So we begin to have imagination and remembering things we have done, and that is memory from the past. And planning for the future, imagination, and talking to ourselves about ourselves, which is often very judgmental. Have I done well? Why did I do this? Why am I so smart, or why am I so dumb? Why did I do this silly thing? And we begin to be very judgmental. So that is the narrative focus, and we tend to do that 99.9% of the time. But there is another self-reference where we are not examining the past or the future, but basically observing experiences. You could say actually this is also meditation, right? That means where the mind is idling and not involved with any task. Now we are into meditative state. So it's actually experiential, moment-to-moment experience. We are observing the moment-to-moment experience and observing what's happening in the mind. So the mind observing the mind, that's really what is going on with this experiential focus, not narrative focus. And we begin to observe sensations and feelings. And this is, in fact, precisely what the Buddha was trying to teach us in Satipatthana, observing bodily activities and sensations and feelings in the body, the first two foundations of mindfulness. And then we begin to observe thoughts arising and passing, right? The coming and going of thoughts. This is, in fact, the third and the fourth foundations of mindfulness. Chittanupassana and Dhammanupassana, thoughts arising and passing, right? So basically, this is really what is going on in the mind when the mind is idling. So when a person tries to meditate, and this is what the question is, I'm sitting quietly, telling myself, breathe in, breathe out. I can do this for a few seconds, and then streams of thoughts coming. And the question, what is the spark that triggers such thoughts? And how does the spark come about? Basically, the spark that triggers these thoughts, that is default mode network. And it is the way default mode network works, goes into narrative focus. So I hope that answers the question, right? The important thing here is, as you can see what this person who asked this question has said, I am sitting quietly, telling myself, breathe in, breathe out. And perhaps this is where the practice needs to be sharper. You don't tell yourself, right, that you're breathing in, you're breathing out. Just observe the breathing. If you are practicing anapanasati, just observe the breathing. You don't tell yourself anything, just observe. Don't narrate. You see, telling yourself, you're bringing the mind into narrative focus. Whereas if you're just observing, it is experiential focus. So it's important that meditation is really the experiential focus of the mind. So I hope that answers the question. Right? Basically, practicing meditation is you don't tell yourself anything. You begin by being aware of the breathing in and the breathing out. So practicing awareness, introspective awareness by just relaxing. So don't tell yourself anything. Okay, the next question is, may I ask, where is the panna coming from, which is needed for samadhi, since it is not from logical thinking, and samadhi is not needed to have samadhi. Now, I must explain the background to this question. This question arose from an earlier question which was answered. The earlier question was talking about practicing samadhi. So I'll show you this diagram. This is the diagram prepared, so you can get a copy of this diagram from the notes that you can download later on. So basically, it was this diagram where Bhante Punnaji explained it, and I drew it up based on his explanation. If you look at the bottom part, the practice that leads to becoming a Sotapan, basically Bhante Punnaji explained by practicing the first 5 stages of the Eightfold Way. The first 5, that means the saddha part and then the sila part. Not yet even into meditation. So meditation is not necessary to attain Sotapan in this state. So here, Bhante Punnaji explained that when you cultivate samadhi, you are cultivating basic wisdom. And that's what it is. So you're cultivating understanding of the Dharma, the basic understanding. And this understanding gives you this foundational wisdom, the basic wisdom. This is not a high level of panna. This is basic wisdom, okay? This is not that state of wisdom up there at the top. That is where a person has cultivated to a very high stage and basically at the doorstep of attaining arahantship. So that is a very high state of introspective wisdom, right? Discerning wisdom. So that is panna. We're not talking about that. We're talking about this very basic wisdom arising from samadhi. In order to understand that, we're going to take a look at the Eightfold Way, right? So first, the question about this basic wisdom. The word wisdom, right? Basic wisdom. The word wisdom, there are a few aspects of what we call wisdom in the Buddhist context. And I'm not referring to the high level of panna. I'm talking about this very foundational, basic level of wisdom. So there are a few aspects of what we call this basic wisdom. And of course, the Pali word for wisdom is panna. Whether you're talking about this fundamental basic wisdom or a very high state of wisdom, this wisdom is still the Pali word is panna. Such wisdom begins with cultivation, where you are learning about the Dharma. And this is from training, from guidance, and from practicing or following the practice, abidance. So in other words, when we first begin to learn the Dharma, we have to study, right? We have to study the basic teachings of the Buddha, the Four Noble Truths. So all this comes from training ourselves and receiving guidance from our teacher, and then practicing, right? And that practicing is abidance, following what was taught, following the instructions of the teacher. So this leads to this is cultivation. And cultivation leads to development. Cultivation basically is the practice of doing. Development is you're beginning to experience the fruits of your doing, right? So the next thing is development. From cultivation comes development, because when we begin to practice the doing leads to fruition, leads to seeing the fruits of our practices. And that is realizing right? The benefits, realizing what is developed. So development is beyond one step further than cultivation. So from cultivation comes development. And development, this leads to understanding and discernment. Then you begin to truly, deeply understand the Dharma and able to discern one thing from another. And this is the most basic form of wisdom when we are cultivating samadhi, right? This normally called right view, but Bhante Punnaji calls this harmonious perspective. This leads to the development of saddha. Right? Saddha, unfortunately, is commonly translated as faith, but it's not. I'll explain later on about saddha. But basically, from cultivation comes development, and from development, it leads to saddha. Saddha is really confidence and devotion. You understand what the Dharma is, and then you begin to feel confident about it. And now you are devoted to it, and people describe this as faith, but this is not faith. This is confidence and devotion. And with devotion, right, we begin to cultivate the next part of the Eightfold Way, samma sankappa. Some people call this right thought or right intention. This is basically wanting to change our lives, wanting to benefit from the practice of Dharma. And Bhante Punnaji calls this harmonious orientation. Right? So if we look at the Eightfold Way and we use, I'm showing both Bhante Punnaji's translation as well as the conventional translation. The first one, samadhi, is harmonious perspective. You begin to see clearly right from wrong, good from bad, one thing from the other, able to discern clearly. So that is also called right view. And then you want to change your life, harmonious orientation, or right intentions, or right thought, right? Samma sankappa. So this group in yellow, collectively is called saddha. Saddha basically means confidence and devotion. You have understood the Dharma, you become confident in it, now you are devoted to wanting to practice it. And that devotion requires virya, willpower, and energy, the effort to do it. So now the yellow part of the Eightfold Way is the foundation. With that comes the practice, the actual practice of sila. Sila normally translated as morality, virtuous morality, right? Where we begin to practice what is called right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Harmonious speech, harmonious action, and harmonious lifestyle. Right? So basically, this is the practice of sila. And of course, that practice of sila is really the purification of the body. In other words, the discipline of our behavior. Right? So in other words, purifying the way we behave, the body. Right? So basically, the mind, the speech, and the body, and the actions. And one of the fundamental things we do is observing the 5 precepts, right? Following, abiding to the 5 precepts. So this is really the practice of sila. And therefore, this basic wisdom is necessary for us to develop saddha, which is confidence and devotion. And finally, we're able to practice sila. And then we go on to practice the rest of the Eightfold Way. Right? So I hope that answers that first question. About learning and cultivation. How can we do that? What do we do in terms of learning and cultivation so that we can gain right view? That is listening to the Dharma. Whenever we hear an experienced speaker or a monk, especially a monastic members who are giving Dharma talks, we listen, listening to the Dharma. And discussion with learned spiritual friends, Kalyana Mitra. So we discuss, and from discussion we learn more. We can actually understand better through discussions to clarify certain misunderstanding or certain concepts we're not clear about. So that's why it's very important to have noble friends, Kalyana Mitra, right? Spiritual friends, where we can share the learning and practice of the Dharma. And then following the instructions of teachers. Having a teacher is important for early stages. We can't go alone. We cannot just read it alone and think that we know everything. We need a teacher to guide us. And one of the best things we can do is attend meditation retreats. Right? And then following examples of wise people by looking at more experienced people, what they do, or people who have attained a higher state of development and how they behave. We learn from their examples, right? And then putting into practice everything that we learn, not just learning it, and putting into practice basically through cultivation and practice, we begin to gain this deeper understanding of the teachings. And over time, one is able to discern right from wrong, good from bad, helpful from harmful, wholesome from unwholesome, wise activity from foolish activity. This is the basic level of wisdom. And development and realization are really the fruits of learning and cultivation. So I hope that answers the question. And now we take a look at the next question, which is actually following on from the previous one. This is after I explained that previous one to the person who asked. Then he came and asked this next part. He says, so sila, samadhi, panna must be referring to higher states if they are in sequence. So knowing the meaning of a Pali word depends on the context of the discussion. Now, Pali is a fairly complex language. It's not so simple because in Pali, one word can have many meanings depending on the context. So I won't go so deep into that. But basically, that question, a part of it, I've already answered earlier on when we talk about the Eightfold Way. So let's take a look at the Eightfold Way again. So we have these three parts: cultivating saddha, which is confidence and devotion, and then putting into practice, cultivating sila, right? And that is practicing virtuous morality so that we can purify our behavior, purify our body, and then purify our mind. So this cultivation of sila is really the purification of the body, disciplining our behavior by observing, beginning with observing the 5 precepts, but we do more than that, including practicing metta and karuna, right? Goodwill, loving kindness, and compassion. And then we practice meditation. And the meditation part, 3 parts here are mentioned by the Buddha in the Eightfold Way. So right effort, right mindfulness, and what is called right concentration, but the more accurate explanation of samadhi is harmonious equilibrium, mental equilibrium, right? So the meditation part is really the purification of the mind, eventually developing insight, vipassana. So basically, this is the purification of the mind. And when the mind becomes pure, finally, it is able to attain that state of higher panna. With higher panna, we can free ourselves from suffering because we have reached that higher state. And when we're able to have panna and that liberation, vimutti, then we are at the doorstep of nibbana. Then we are really knocking on the door of arahantship already. Right? But that is for the final stage of cultivation, purification of the mind. Now, this practice of meditation, when we talk about sama vayama, right effort, or Bhante Punnaji calls this harmonious exercise, then in the sutras, it's mentioned very clearly that it is the practice of these 4 harmonious exercises called chattari samapadana. Right? I won't go into details on this. I have already recorded this. If you go through my YouTube, you will find a recording on harmonious exercise. So chattari samapadana is explained. And then, of course, the practice of satipatthana, introspective attention or systematic introspection. And finally, the practice of this last part, harmonious equilibrium, samadhi, the ultimate practice there is this 7 steps to awakening, satta bojjhanga. Okay, so I hope that answers that question there. We've basically covered all the 4 questions. Right? Now, when we talk about meditation, Bhante Punnaji has kept it very simple in his book, Arya Marga Bhavana. This is the meditation guide, level 1, where he explained when we talk about cultivation of meditation, basically is the progress in meditation consists of 4 steps. In other words, in order to progress with our meditation, we got to associate with those mature in mind. We got to listen to the Dharma and understand it, right? And then we got to apply the thinking, this basic wisdom to be able to discern. And this ability to discern is deterministic thinking. Deterministic thinking comes from the term determinism. Determinism, basically, Bhante Punnaji has stated that determinism, he explained, it means that when something happens, it happens because of the presence of necessary conditions. Well, some people call it cause and effect, but basically, when conditions are right, certain conditions are in place, then the outcome will happen. Whatever happens, it happens because of the necessary conditions. That is really deterministic thinking, the ability to discern the cause and effect and how things come to be, how things arise and fade, right? And this is Yoniso Manasikara. So basically, this is about this cultivating this state of mind, the ability to discern clearly, right from wrong, good from bad, and so on. Okay, and finally, to be able to reorganize our life, reorientate our life. All this you can read in details. I won't explain much further. Download that book, Arya Marga Bhavana Level 1. I'll give you the link at the end of this presentation. Right, then you can read through all this. So I hope this has been helpful. And finally, in summary, Bhante Punnaji stated it very clearly. Bhavana, which is often translated as meditation, it's about a development of the mind. So it is by being conscious all the time that we can control our emotions. The constant practice of being conscious is what the Buddha called development or bhavana. Okay, and now you can download this document, tiny.cc/QAFORUM1. Today's sharing, all the slides you have seen, you can download the complete set through this link. And then you can also download that Arya Marga Bhavana Level 1 meditation guide by Bhante Punnaji through that link there. So you can use these links to download. And if you have any more questions, I can deal with it in the next QA forum. You can always write to me. Now, the Arya Marga Bhavana Level 1, the cover looks like that. So if you download the correct document, then that is what you will get. You can go to that link to download that. So you can write to me through my email, and you can also contact me through my Facebook. This is posted in my Facebook. You can then put comments below it and questions. Then I can deal with these questions in the next forum. Right? That will be next Monday. So I will come again online next Monday to answer your questions more thoroughly. Okay, so I hope that has been helpful. Let's come to the sharing part. Now, if you have any questions, please put there. I'm not going to answer any further today's questions. I will prepare the answers to your questions and provide them at the next sharing. So we have spent the past 1.5 hours or 1 hour plus sharing the Dharma. So it has been a very fruitful experience for all of us. I would like to thank all of you, sadhu, 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 for joining us. And let us now share the merits of our effort by dedicating them to people who are having difficulty with the coronavirus pandemic. Let's put our palms together and recite this together. We dedicate the merits we have acquired from sharing the Buddha Dharma to all beings affected by the coronavirus pandemic around the world. May suffering beings be suffering-free. May the fear-struck fearless be. May grieving beings shed all grief. May all beings find peace and relief. By the grace of the merits we have acquired, may we never follow the foolish. May we follow only the wise until we attain the highest and most supreme bliss of Nibbana. Idang me nyatinang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. Idang me nyatinang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. Idang me nyatinang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.